Hare Krishna. So we are reading from the book Miracle on Second Avenue, written by Mukunda Goswami. So starting from part one, that is New York, the Bowery Swami. First chapter, A Gesture of Friendship, August 1966. The phone was ringing. It had been eerily silent for the past 2 days. Hello, I said. Mr. Michael, there has been some trouble. It was the Swami's voice, raspy but concerned, warm and paternal. I had met the Swami only a few months ago. There had been some trouble. I read the article in the New York Times, he said. I cringed, thinking of the Swami reading the article. Michael Grant, 24, was charged with offering narcotics to a minor, accused of statutory rape, possession with the intent to sell narcotics, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. No, I think it's all under control now, I blurted into the phone. Some lawyers are working on it, and they tell me it will be over in a few weeks. Nothing to worry about. I was trying to sound optimistic even though my nightmare was far from over. Can you come here for lunch? I think so. When? We have lunch every day at 1. Can you come today? Yes, I think so. Yes, I'll come. See you then. Goodbye. The week before the Swami's phone call, I had been arrested in Hurleyville, New York, and jailed for 5 days. After the New York Times article appeared, my piano tuner didn't answer my phone calls. Neither did my work contacts or my friends. My social circle crumbled overnight. Everyone hated me, or so it seemed. The FBI, the Hurleyville police, the New York State Troopers, the New York Times, the Musicians Union, and apparently even my small cluster of friends. Where were they? Why didn't they care, or at least phone? I could explain that the charges were false. I hadn't done anything wrong. I wasn't caught in bed with Henry's 15-year-old girlfriend, like the state cops told his pals. And she wasn't my companion, like the New York Times said. Although I was far from a saint at 24, I wasn't that bad. As I was being arrested, it occurred to me that this event had the potential to turn my musical career into a complete shambles. Publicity like this scared people. Although I was well known and slightly idolized by a few people in the jazz underworld, and although I had made the grade in that world with a kind of twisted fame, my bubble had burst. Now I had felt it was me and my partner, Jan, alone against the rest of the world. Who was that? Asked Jan when I hung up the phone. It was Swami. Geez, I never thought he would call. You know, maybe this whole arrest thing is a sign. Maybe we should just chuck the whole thing and live more simply, you know. Move out to the country or to somewhere else in the world, some place like India. What do you think? I don't want to hang around for the court case. Oh, I don't know, she sighed. If you don't show up for the hearing and they catch you, then you'll really be in trouble. Things were changing in my life fast. Within the past 2 years, both my parents had died, and with a modest inheritance in hand and an obliging, fun partner, I could really see myself leaving New York for good, maybe for some exotic destination. Now, in the midst of my legal quagmire, I felt I should have left the city long ago. A few hours later, I headed over to the Swami's new location on 2nd Avenue, about a half-hour walk from my place in the Bowery. It was hot and muggy. The corner garbage cans overflowed. As usual, the Bowery smelled like a mixture of urine and beer, an unmistakable odor that always hung in the summer air in that part of Manhattan. I had gotten used to the non-stop rumble of cars and trucks along the Bowery. Most of the people on the wide sidewalk were drunks, but there were a few delivery men and Chinese on their way to or from Chinatown on the other side of Canal Street. There was a huge black felt announcement board propped up in the front window of the small storefront I'd helped the Swami secure 6 weeks earlier. Inch high white letters were struck into the grooves of the board. Classes on Bhagavad Gita, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 7 p.m. Chant Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, and your life will be sublime. Glancing inside the storefront as I passed, I saw that the bare place had been transformed into a tiny Indian temple. An expensive looking oriental patterned rug stretched from the front of the room all the way down to the back windows that looked out onto the courtyard and were cloaked with heavy drapes. Decorations hung from the ceiling, including a large cymbal that I had once seen a guy named Howard playing. There was a low platform covered in maroon velvet and hung with tassels, from which I had seen the Swami lecture, and behind it an enormous circular painting of Lord Krishna and his consort Radha. The smell of incense and crushed rose petals drifted from the room. The tambura I had brought for the Swami some months ago sat in one corner. I went through a dim hallway into a small, leafy courtyard and then up the 12 stairs to his second floor apartment. My heart was beating fast from the climb. The door was slightly ajar, and through it wafted the fresh and alluring aroma of sandalwood and jasmine, mixed with the rich smell of Indian cooking spices. I pushed open the door. 7 men were sitting on the floor with their backs against the walls of a small living room that had no furniture, carpets, or rugs. They were eating off wax paper and from plastic and glass bowls and an unusual assortment of drinking glasses. Sunlight flooded through the curtainless windows, spreading in warm pools on the clean wooden slat floor. The Swami smiled up at me from the cushion where he sat on the floor. Mr. Michael, come, sit, eat. You're okay? His hospitality encouraged me. I felt like an invited special guest. The Swami watched his visitors eat the lunch he had prepared for them, monitoring their progress through their meals and replenishing the preparations as they disappeared from their plates. I took my place beside one of the other guests on the floor, and Janice, the guy helping the Swami serve the meal, gave me a plate piled high with food. I drifted into vegetarianism several years ago, but this looked a lot better than the food I usually ate. I had been experimenting with macrobiotic food and often ate at a restaurant called The Paradox on the Lower East Side, a place that I learned a few years later was frequented by Yoko Ono. Macrobiotic food was not particularly inspiring for me, and the Swami's vegetarian food looked appetizing and exotic. Instead of bland brown rice and zucchinis, sesame seeds and beans, the spread before me consisted of hot dal made with lentils and vegetables and fresh herbs. steaming fluffy rice, warm wholemeal chapatis, brushed with a little butter, lightly spiced potatoes, and a warm milk with bananas. Suddenly, I was hungry. Yeah, I'm fine, Swami, I said. How do you like your new place? It was the first time I had sat with him to talk for some time. Very nice, very nice. And the temple is nice also. He turned his attention to the man sitting to his left. Stanley, Stanley, take. He kept handing Stanley warm chapatis. Stanley was nearly 6 feet tall, gaunt and emaciated looking, with short black hair, stubble, and sharp angular features. After 11 chapatis, the Swami laughed heartily and said, My spiritual master, he didn't like fat disciples. Stanley just shrugged off the Swami's comment and kept eating. But I thought I saw a slight smile on his face and sensed that he was laughing internally with the Swami. Second chapter, The Seeker. Although I had known the Swami for what amounted to only a matter of months, when I joined his guest for lunch that day, I felt that my meeting him had been a long time coming, that it was the latest episode in a string of events throughout my life. I had come from a conservative Jewish background, but I had a distinct rebellious streak that I nurtured from an early age. Social clubs, sports, and playing in bands were the main things about school that interested me, although I was keen on music and literature. As a teenager, I enthusiastically consumed good writing. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Billy Wilder's Stalag 17, Somerset Maugham's The Razor's Edge, Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, Graham Greene's The Third Man, Saul Bellows' The Adventures of Augie March, Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, Lawrence Ferlinghetti's Pictures of the Gone World, and lots of Dylan Thomas. When I was 16, I started drinking rather heavily, smoking pot and hanging out with musicians, many of whom were older than I was. Some wore goatees and some were pimps. My parents seemed oblivious to it all, including the fact that I was smoking and not just cigarettes. During this time, I became friends with Dick Miller, who was the most rebellious but academically brilliant guy in school. Although he was in all the high academic classes, he was everything the older generations hated. He cut class, came to school drunk, worked as a male prostitute, and had affairs with female members of staff who were twice his age. He exposed me to the underworld of dope, prostitution, and jazz. I admired his outspokenness and his rejection of the system in which we had been raised. I laughed at the world with him, and in some ways even emulated his behavior. Then, when Dick and I were 17, the car he was driving was involved in a head on collision with a truck. The other members of his family in the car were not seriously injured, but he was killed. His funeral was held in Seattle, a 2 hour drive from my home in Portland. I rode up to the service with a teacher of mine, Wayne Altry, and a friend named Craig. The funeral parlor was full of flowers and loud, dreary organ music and blinding sunlight from the clerestory windows. Dick's ex girlfriend, Linda, was there, dressed in white, her cheeks stained black with tears and mascara. She looked grey. I filed past the coffin with the other mourners. When I saw Dick's face bruised black and blue in the open casket, I felt sick. It was the first time I had come face to face with death, and I couldn't process what had happened to this person who was the same age as me. I was overcome with grief and rode back to Portland in complete silence while Craig whimpered in the back seat. Barely able to function, I ran into Altry some days later as I drifted between classes. How are you doing? He asked. Not so good. You know, he said, bad things are going to happen in life, even to extraordinary people like Dick. But why? I asked, not really expecting an answer. I don't really know, he paused. You need a teacher, he said. You are my teacher. I mean, a teacher who can explain this stuff, someone who has some answers. I didn't take Altry's advice very seriously, but I did become interested in philosophy in my early 20s. I easily accommodated the Eastern and Oriental variety and was attracted to the works of Aldous Huxley, especially books such as Doors of Perception, which leaned eastward and touted the here and now philosophy. Despite being something of a spiritual seeker, I was an agnostic. I had witnessed a great deal of hypocrisy in the people of God in my childhood. My parents considered religion more or less an add on to a happy, successful life. Their Judaism seemed to me seems to me to be based more on social intercourse than on spirituality. There was a lot of discrimination and condensation towards other faiths. Shortly after my bar mitzvah, I mentally renounced identification with Judaism. When I was 19, I moved to New York to seek a career as a musician. I lived in the center of the city and began working to establish myself in the underground world of jazz. In 1962, when I was 20, I married Beverly, a small woman with dark brown hair, brown eyes, and a round face. We had been friends through most of high school, but I had known her since age 7. Due to our mutual infidelity throughout our 4-year marriage, she moved out and I was left on my own. After Beverly and I separated, I returned to Portland, Oregon for a brief family visit. While I was there, I met Jan. She was quiet and petite and struck me as glamorous with her striking blue eyes and long black hair. My first words to her were, what do you think of getting high? If you have to ask, you couldn't possibly know, she answered coolly. We both took LSD that day. It was her first time, and her older sister John thought she shouldn't have. That night, in an old rented house on the southeast side of town, Jan and I paired off, and the two other couples there thought it was great, if a bit abrupt. The next day, we watched an art film at Reed College and began our private dialogue. We were both at loose ends with nothing much to do, except that I wanted to go back to New York and she wanted to do something different and new. We drove to New York the week after we met in a 1957 Chevrolet I had brought from my brother. Joan thought Jan was being impulsive and that New York City was too dangerous for her. Since it was winter, we decided to drive from Portland via the southern route to New York. When we got into Northern California, it was snowing hard and we almost ran out of gas. But we coasted a lot in neutral with the engine off and managed to make it to the next gas station without freezing to death on the remote mountain road covered with deep snow on both sides. Once in New York, we moved into a loft on the top floor of 110 Bowery. Our loft was an AIR, Artists in Residence apartment, that, like so many building top floors at the time, was undecorated and functioned as both a studio and a home. The place was huge, nearly 2,000 square feet, and the rent was cheap, only $55 a month. We didn't care about the lousy neighborhood. We just wanted our own place with space and privacy and the ability to make as much noise as we wanted any time of the day or night. We made lot of noise, lot of music with the alternative people we met, and we made sure that books like the Kama Sutra weren't lost on us. We began to explore various spiritual and religious experiences which were as prevalent and easy to come by in New York as drugs. A couple of months into our stay in New York, I visited an uptown Swami in Manhattan's chic East 50s. It was an informal lecture in what looked like a converted apartment. The plush, well decorated room was redolent with white pipe smoke. Portly grey men and women sat motionless in overstuffed leather chairs. The Indian Swami's squeaky voice grated on my nerves. No cohesive message emerged. Sometimes later, I attended New York's first Zen Institute. The first floor of the Manhattan Browntown apartment front room had been made into a sparsely decorated and immaculately clean temple room with folding chairs, white curtains, and a dark, sickly green carpet. About 10 followers in their middle to late 30s, older people, I thought, were seated waiting in apparent expectation. A small, shaven headed Oriental monk dressed in black came from the rear down the middle aisle to take his place at the front of the room. He stood before what appeared to be a small altar, a table draped in white cloth upon which sat a clean glass bowl of bananas, oranges, apples, and peaches. Someone passed out a small song sheet. We all read and chanted together, following the monk. O Romoso, Dolojopo, me fese dere I, li mi jikiri. The song was about 20 lines long and it took about 10 minutes to sing, repetitions included. The monk's voice rang out above the others. After the chant, he exited as fast as he had entered, disappearing through a door at the back of the room, which banged shut after him. About six of the American Buddhist members of the audience invited me to another room upstairs for an informal chat, which turned out to be a conversation at a round table centered on fasting. The main message from what I could gather was don't break a fast with orange juice. I was unimpressed. How was this spiritual? God, I thought, I'll never go back there. A few weeks later, on the recommendation of a friend, I talked with an elderly Christian priest. This monumental 4-minute meeting took place after a 1 hour wait in the foyer of a huge New York church in Upper Manhattan. I was annoyed at being made to stand and wait. I felt like I was waiting in line to get a driver's license. The priest finally showed up wearing an overcoat and walked briskly towards me. He was tall and gray haired and wore a suit and smiled a lot. Are you the one waiting to see me? He asked. Yes. And what can I do for you today? I thought quickly. What's the most important teaching to concentrate on? Once I visited Mother Vivian, he said. What? He suddenly became very still and got a far off look in his eyes. She was living in a convent in a small village in southern Italy. When I looked into her eyes, I knew she knew something I didn't know. Her eyes were clear, they were limpid. I knew she was wise. What did she say? She didn't say anything. I expected her to say a little bit, but she didn't say a word. She just looked at me, and I knew what I had to know. She was in another world. That was enough for me. I have a meeting to go now. I have a meeting to go to now. And in a friendly, paternal way, he touched my shoulder and added, I hope you don't mind. Discouraged by the results of these various spiritual explorations, I decided to go it alone. I began reading Tao, Zen, various types of Buddhism, Confucianism, and the Bhagavad Gita, Juan Mascaro's translation. All of these scriptures made me curious but skeptical. The Bhagavad Gita, which I had heard a lot about, was a very short book and made me particularly uncomfortable. As a peacenik of sorts, I couldn't figure out why the scriptural conversation between Krishna and Arjuna took place on a battlefield. Why was a war fought between a deep spiritual discourse? The contradiction bothered me. I asked Surya Kumari, an acquaintance of mine from Madras, who was trained in classical Indian music. She said the book was a symbolic discourse that meant we had to fight out our own lives. That made some sense, but her offhand answer didn't really quell my doubts about the book. Several weeks later, I ran into an associate on a cross-town bus. Mickey was an African American jazz drummer with whom I had worked. His face was wrinkled and he had short brown hair that formed a cap over a long pointed head. I had come to his rescue some months earlier on the Staten Island ferry when a drunken white Vietnam vet had been trying to pick a fight with him. After I had managed to calm the fat, obnoxious drunk, Mickey and I had stood and talked at the rail of the ferry as the boat churned through the icy Atlantic waters 40 feet below. So we'll stop here for today. We'll continue tomorrow ahead. Hare Krishna. Thank you so much.